I used to teach a lot. Remember, I was the owner of Chicago School of Mold Making, and so it was always repeat, repeat, repeat. And if you spend too much time on the basics, which are critical, you never get to the good stuff. And what I want to do is to displace the basics into self-teaching. Hi, I'm Michael Joy. Welcome back to Hand-ufacturing. We are starting a new series in a series of some how-tos. However, those of you who have watched our videos before know that I'm pretty much old school guy, and we're going old school, which means that when I was 30 years old, I took a couple years off to write a series of mold making books called The Art of Mold Making. The first few volumes were for the ceramic industry. And if you've heard the story before, you know I spent all this time writing these books, and then when I got the contract from the publisher, I think it was American Ceramic Society, it was a crap contract and I ended up not going with it, and so a lot of this stuff stayed dormant for decades. But Pasha said that he has some ideas on how to revitalize this information, and we have over 100 sequences of how-to information. It's not just for the ceramicist, but that's where we're starting. My goal is to present some information that might be helpful teaching tools for the actual instructors out there. If you're teaching high school, university, community college, you name it, design school. The plaster mold making for ceramics, even if you're not a ceramicist, is actually pretty valuable understanding because you'll learn about undercuts and mold design and things like this. We're going to start with very simple things, and each mold sequence is going to build on the other, and we're going to go from one-part molds all the way up into making molds of egg cartons and chain links and some more complicated things. So if you're able to tolerate the old school quality of the photographs, hey, no video, it was just me and a little 35mm camera on a tripod in some shitty studio conditions. If you can get past that, there's some real gems in here. And hey, it's all free, so enjoy. All right, here we go. So this is me wishing I could time travel. You know, these are old photographs and I decided not to put any Photoshop effort into them. So we're just gonna go commando on these. The first mold sequence that I have is very good for teaching about mixing plaster and simple mold design and undercuts. We're using a little red plastic cup. And I'm gonna talk about some things. It's gonna be over-talked. Remember, this is just going to be pretty rough mold making, but the points are going to be made clearly. So what we have here is always I'm saying work on a workboard. The workboards that I used in the day were laminated sink cutouts. That simply means that when you ordered a countertop, the company cut a hole in the laminated top and the scraps became my workboards. They're great if you can still get them. Otherwise, use a laminated piece of wood from the hardware store or a laminated piece of tile, and but you can't use raw wood. So on that lamination, I'm putting some mold soap here. Now, a lot of the things I'm going to show are not necessary for a particular mold step. These aren't rules. There's a dozen different ways that you could come at something. And each sequence that I show, I want to show something different. So sometimes it's a little overkill. But what I'm doing right here in this photograph is I've mixed up a small amount of plaster and I'm pouring it into the cup, and I'm actually going to use that plaster to seal it to the workboard. I've let the plaster set up in a sort of a tofu-like stage, and I'm going to dump it upside down on the workboard. The plaster has spread inside the cup and it's acting like glue, and what I've done now is I've put a hole in there just to release some of the air pressure in the cup, and now I'm trimming away the partially set plaster around the edge of the cup. Now all that's left to do is to clean the model, and what you want to use is just a wet sponge. It doesn't have to have any soap or anything like that. I've cleaned up around the cup and I've cleaned the cup itself. This is a pretty important step. First off, you want to have a mold that's square, and so I would use these metal carpenter squares, these L's, I don't know what they're really called, and an oil pencil. The oil pencils are better than Sharpie markers, I think, because you have some more flexibility with the quality of line that it puts down on a soapy workboard. Also, the Sharpies get expensive and they get clogged up, so the oil pencils are really your friend. Basically, for this size of cup, which is the model, I've put a 1-inch border around the cup, which means that there's going to be 1 inch of plaster all around the cup. Now, since I washed the board off, I'm putting, just as a precautionary method, I'm putting on some more mold soap. This is neutral potash pottery soap. It's not the Murphy's oil soap. It's none of that stuff. This is proper potter soap. I'll bring up a link to how to buy that. I really like this. It's very water soluble, and you don't get into any issues about the soap clogging the pores of the plaster. In my shop, I've had a variety of different mold boards. They're called cottle boards, mold boards, clink boards. These are called clink boards. These are aluminum boards that I made myself. I would cut the aluminum on a table saw, and my friend had a shop that I could do these bends. They're hard to make on your own. If you're at a school, you could work with the metal department to make these. It's about an 1/8 inch thick metal, which is the minimum that you want for any sort of clink board that's going to be over 6 or 7 inches tall. These clink boards are adjustable. We'll probably have to upload some pictures on the various configurations that they can have, but they're the fastest way, in my mind, to make a mold box for pouring plaster or silicone. And if you have the wooden mold box, mold boards, it's no problem. You just need to soap the inside of that wood. It's called sizing the boards. You just need to size the boards with your mold soap and proceed as if you had the metal like you're about to see. All right, the next thing you need to do is you need to make your mold box watertight. In the photograph, I'm using an oil-based clay, but after a while, I moved away from that, and I started using oil-based clay. The water-based clay smears really nice. It's easy on the hands, but it's kind of one-and-done clay. If you're a ceramicist, you have it all over the place. But if you're not, oil clay is really good. It's reusable, and you can throw it in the microwave to soften it up, and then you get to smear it pretty generously and without any waste. I've mixed up plaster. I'm not showing the mixing right now. I'm just showing the pouring. We'll get to that in a sort of an appendix version here. We'll continue. And you notice that the spring clamps are at the top of the mold box. Now, had I been thinking at the time I took the pictures, I would have taken the spring clamps and tilted them out a little bit more to give me more pouring room to get into the mold box. But what I did to compensate for that is I didn't pour straight from the bucket. I poured into a cup, and then I'm pouring into the mold box. The reason is I have a much more controlled pour. If you haven't poured plaster before, it's nice to kind of go baby steps at a time rather than this big old bucket going in. Now, if you've made molds before and you noticed, oh, I didn't make a pouring indication line, that was deliberate because I want to show that you can use your knife, this is a fettling knife here, and you can dip that knife into your poured plaster, or your finger for that matter, and you can just see how thick the plaster is above the cup. And in this instance, it's about 1 inch thick, so I know I have the right amount. And again, you can mark it ahead of time before you pour, or you can do a double check like this. The big deal of why I put that cup down with plaster is if I had a weak connection of any kind in that cup would be floating at this point right now, and my whole mold would be lost. So anytime you can take a buoyant object and fill it with clay or fill it with plaster so that it doesn't distort your shape of the model, you're off to a good start. You don't want to make molds of things that float unless you're ready for that kind of behavior to happen. All right, so now what's happened is I've removed the clink boards, set them aside. I have not dislodged the model from the workboard because I like that little bit of a stick on the board right there that I can use that configuration to my advantage. So I'm going to be scraping the sides of this mold and cleaning up my workboard right here. You can see that I'm using a mud knife first to kind of scrape off these sharp edges. I don't like handling those molds. That plaster can be pretty razor sharp, but it's just a quick way to chop, 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 and then scrape off the dust. When you scoop the dust, don't just scoop it off of the workboard onto the floor. Go right into a trash can. Save yourself the steps. Now use the mud knife to get under your mold and create a little bit of leverage to release the suction from the workboard. This is where you'll see a lot of different mold makers either overwork or underwork a mold here. And what I use is the full length, I think they're 10 or 11 inch Sureform blades. And before the plaster has set completely, meaning it's not dry, but it's firm, I shave that, just kind of tip that Rubik's Cube everywhere and I shave. I might hit it 1-2 times, tip it 1-2 times, but you don't have to keep sanding it, Sureforming it again and again. You can do it pretty quickly, and you don't need to take off a 1/2 inch or anything. You just need to take off a chip edge, which means a slightly rounded edge should exist on your finished plaster mold. If you wait until your mold is done and dry and you go to shave it, what happens is you end up having a lot of dry dust all over the place, as well as it's much harder to shave the fully set mold than it is when it's wet. Now, the consequence of that is your Sureform, if you shave it when the mold is wet is the Surform is going to clog up with wet plaster and it's going to rust out the blade. So before you use your Surform, you can spray it with WD-40 as a release agent or sort of a barrier coat, if you will, to protect the metal. And then you have to wash out the Surform blade right away after you use it with wet plaster and use a wire brush to clean those little grit blades out. Otherwise, you're just going to burn through these blades and they're $5 or $6 a shot, and there's no sense on wasting. Now I've flipped the mold over and I'm just quickly popping the plaster shell, the rim that was in effect glue for me. Now remember, there's a lot of ways that you could have done this. I chose not to use hot glue at the time because I didn't want the hot glue squishing out of the edges of the cup. The wet plaster was a real clean way to clean the cup up, and so now I'm just extracting the cup from the mold. Bash the shell. Now I just collapse the cup, twist it, and pull it out. You don't want to dig in there to try to get this cup out. You could use a little compressed air and it would do the same thing. So here you see the finished mold and the cup, and you can look at the mold and you can see that if you back up in your mind to where I drew the lines around the cup, you can now see that that represented the block of plaster that it has become. The reason that I didn't go thinner with plaster is because I've basically made a complex engineered sponge, meaning the plaster is going to be, its whole purpose is to absorb moisture from the casting slip that's coming up. If I have too small of a plaster mold, it won't create enough of a draw, and also my mold will get too wet too fast, and then I can only cast once or twice a day, and then I got to let the mold dry out. So the bigger the plaster mold, not a rule, I go about 1 inch, the better in the sense that you want more porosity. But you can't make a mold too big or you're going to be too heavy. But you get the sense of scale here from the cup to the mold. All right, so here we are on to the plaster mixing. There's a lot of ways to mix plaster. You have to choose which you're most comfortable with. I've mixed a lot of plaster by hand, and I'll show you how to do that, and also mixed a lot of plaster by power mixing. If you're mixing small amounts of plaster by hand is fine, but after months of it, it kind of dries out your skin and it's hard on your fingernails and everything. And I just think even with gloves, it's not ideal. So what I'm showing here in this first photo sequence is the bucket that I put in here. I simply cut it because I'm going to show you some hand motions here. But in any bucket that has lines molded into it from the manufacturer, those lines become very hard to see, and I always put black lines at those points for quick visual reference, because ultimately I'm going to be pouring water into those, and if I have pre-marked lines, I don't need 2 buckets. I can put the water right in my 1 bucket and not have to use a measuring bucket. But in this instance, I'm going to do both methods here just as an overkill to show you. As mixing buckets get old, they get a little scratched up and they begin to hold on to plaster. And you can see in my bucket here that there's plaster residue in there. Now that's pretty much adhered into the bucket, and it actually is not a big deal. You would think it is, but I've done it a bunch of times and it's seldom a problem. What I'm doing right now is I'm trying to alleviate the adhesion, future adhesion to the bucket. So each time I would pour into kind of an old crappy bucket, I'd put a layer of Vaseline inside the bucket. You don't want to put too heavy. It's just a little swish swish in there, and then you wipe it with a towel and it will extend the life of your buckets. Now, buckets add up. It's not me being totally cheap, but I hate throwing away plastic, so this is what I do. So as you know, I just said that with lines in a bucket, you wouldn't have to measure out the water. But in this instance, this shop that I was working in actually didn't have running water. So I was always chasing water around, and I have pre-measured using this little bucket over here. Probably, I don't know what it was for this demo, a couple quarts of water, a gallon of water, I don't know. The ratio that I always used with pottery plaster was 1 gallon of water to 11 pounds of plaster, #1 pottery plaster, and then I would add, if it was available, 1 pound of hydrocal for additional strength. That hydrocal didn't interfere with the porosity of the mold, it did make the mold a little bit stronger. So you always put in water first before you add dry plaster. You also notice there that there's a box fan with a filter. This is the kind of the poor man's spray booth, and it's basically to keep plaster dust out of your face. I got tired of wearing masks at times for small mixes, or they weren't within range, or I was forgetting, but the fan filter is great. This is a really good type of scale to use for weighing plaster. If you have a digital packing scale, that's terrific, but like I said, when I photographed this when I was 30, I didn't have any coin, and everything pretty much came from a thrift store. So you get a fruit scale, you're in good shape, and I was weighing out 11 pounds here. You just have to make sure you tear out or zero out the scale with the weight of the bucket, and there's no water in this bucket, it's just dry plaster. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking one handful of dry plaster at a time, and I'm sort of quick sifting it into the water. It shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes at most to get that plaster into the water. If you dump it with the bucket, it can go in big lumps. So sift it with your hand quickly and sift it around the whole area of the bucket, not just in the center. Once your dry plaster is into the bucket, you can let it sit for about 3 minutes. And this is where that filter fan really comes in handy. You just have to make sure that that filter is directionally positioned, because those filters are designed to draw air one way through. They'll work both ways, but it's ideal to read the directions on the filter. It has an arrow. This is just illustrating that it's one handful of plaster and sifted all the way around, a little visual overkill here. Basically, what I'm showing you is that you're going to start to see these little islands of plaster. Let them dissolve in a little bit before you add more to it. It also looks like, I don't have a photo of it, but it looks like I put in some red iron oxide in here for this mixing demo. Now this mixing demo happened at a different time than the mold making of the cup happened, so that's why you didn't see red plaster. This is where a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to add plaster until I have an island. That can be very misleading unless you do it a lot, especially for slip casting molds where you want to have a precision measurement. I usually only measure by weight for slip casting molds. If I was doing just some layup or something, I could do it by hand, but this is what that island looks like, and I'm getting really close to having all of the plaster in. I'm going to dump in the last bit here. Now that the plaster has been put into the bucket, I'm going to let it sit for at least 3 minutes, and I've used room temperature water. You don't have to use cold water. Hot water will make it set faster. And from the last picture also, you notice that my dry bucket looked kind of scruffy. I wasn't worried about pouring chunks in there. The chunks, like from the dirty bucket, are really not a problem because that had been wiped out. So it looked dirtier than it actually was. Had I been a wealthier guy at the time, I probably would have had brand spanking new buckets, but hey, you know, we make do. Now what I'm doing is I'm just jogging the bucket a little bit on the floor. And also, this is a reminder for me to tell you that when you're done adding your water and your plaster, you should not try to carry your bucket only by the handle. Those handles can pop out pretty much. So I don't know if I'm missing a photo or why, but that handle and your hand under the bucket, whenever you're transporting that material, don't trust handles. I'm getting ready to mix the plaster by hand. Remember, I want to show you a bunch of different ways. I don't mix plaster by hand these days, and I have a little bit of hair on my arms, so I'm putting Vaseline for a couple reasons. Not to stick to the hair on my arms, but also not to extract moisture from my skin. You can already see that my hands have handled a lot of plaster this day. So I got my hand in the plaster here. We're going to do a cutaway shot of what's actually happening under the bucket here, but you can see that I've done a rough mix. I'm actually going like this, you'll see. I did this cutaway because I wanted to show you the first thing I do on the bottom of that bucket is I get all the dry material, well, it's not dry at this point, but the muddy material off the bottom of the bucket. Some buckets have these textures, and you want to make sure that you don't have any sludge at the bottom. So I'm doing this first in the mixing, and then I'm going to do this scooping and swirling. Photo 14, I'm just going to show you these hands. Hey man, if I had a video camera at the time, this would have only taken a minute to show you, but like I said, we're back in time here. So it's this scooping method of bringing it from the bottom to the top, like a baker, doing something bakery-ish. 15, same thing, open, close, open, close. You're creating a curtain. If you mix a lot, you can kind of create this little air suds, and it's important to get scoop those air suds out. They're just bubbles basically, and put them off in the trash or a bucket. Yeah, photo 17 is I'm just flicking the plaster into the bucket, meaning the suds, and cleaning out the plaster. It's like scraping the impurities off of the plaster. A lot of people wonder when plaster is ready to pour. You can do different types of things. One is you can go by time, but if you go by time, you just want to make sure that you're following the time all the way across. You have a certain temperature of water, your shop is consistent temperature, you are using consistent mixing methods, everything's standardized. Then you can go like clockwork. But if you're doing many things in your shop, you're just like, oh crap, I forgot that plaster's slaking. I gotta run over and catch that. It's been there more than 3 minutes. You can stir your plaster back up a little bit, and then you dip one or a couple fingers into it. It's called the mitten test. And if you can extract your fingers and not see your skin detail, it's ready to pour. If it looks milky, it's too soon to pour, but if it looks creamy, you're good. So now you can see that I'm pouring off the plaster. This is into a urethane master mold, and basically it's just to show how I'm pouring into the corner. It doesn't really, I haven't found it really to matter where you pour, you just pour into the urethane mold. Okay, here's the deal that I see a lot of other mold makers on YouTube, what they do with their wet plaster. Some people dump it into a bag, some people let it, who knows what, who knows what. But what I like to do is, if you have extra plaster, you want to roll that plaster in your bucket into a cardboard box, which I don't have a picture of here. I'm dumping the last remaining amount of plaster into my trash can. Now these trash cans didn't have bags. Again, I didn't like to throw out plaster, and I never let them get too heavy, so it wasn't a big deal. But basically I'm rolling this so the whole bucket gets coated with a shell, and this way when the plaster has set, it cracks out very nicely into the trash can, and you can just mix, roll, set the bucket aside, and you can crack out the buckets later in the day. But there's a trick to it with old shitty buckets. If you use a rubber mallet to crack out the shell in your bucket, you're going to crack your bucket. The old buckets used to have more sort of vinyl in them, and they were more flexible. Today's buckets tend to be, unless you have an expensive one, tend to be pretty brittle. And so what I would do is I would hold the hammer backwards, and I would just smack it with the handle versus the rubber mallet. And that seemed to do a pretty good job. The same thing inside. You can use the handle and put your bucket on the table and use the handle to smash it. Don't hit it with the black part of the hammer. It sounds all tedious to show all this, but you'll save a lot of buckets and not cracking them out, splitting them. That completes the how to mix plaster by hand sequence there. And you can see in the photographs it looks pretty tedious. It's like, oh, you're showing the hand motion, and it's not that precise. These are just guidelines, because a lot of people, when they start mixing plaster, and remember this is ideally for students, is they don't even know where to start. Am I over mixing? Am I whipping? Am I chopping? You know, all this sort of stuff. But mixing plaster is 1, 2, 3, and you're pretty good to go. It's pretty forgiving material. And then the other thing is especially in classes, you don't want your students to burn through those buckets. So some good handling at the beginning will make those last longer with the Vaseline and the proper cracking. This is how I power mix plaster. We did some video reviews of this French master mold maker. And in his shop, he was really set up, and he had converted a drill press into a mixing station, and he just kind of put his bucket there, lowered a thing, and he was good to go. But I wasn't mixing plaster that much after I kind of left the ceramics world, and this is the alternative that I came up with. Basically what you see here is a cordless drill with a 1/4-20 threaded rod. You'll notice the rod is long enough for me to stay standing up without having to bend over and sort of create weird postures. And the disc on the end is the plastic insert of a car buffing wheel disc. He's like, what is that? Well, you go to Walmart and you look for car buffing, there's these cotton chamois. Well, there's a disc that goes into that chamois to hold its shape for buffing, and it's slightly flexible. And that's just wing nutted onto the bottom of the 1/4-20, and then it's put in the drill. And it's actually perfect for mixing, because if you put the propellers on, it makes too much air in the mix, and we'll just show you here. So photo 2, if you carry the memory forward of photo 1, you saw that the disc was pivoted at an angle. And the reason is that as you start rotating the plaster, not too fast, but it will create sort of this little vortex in the bucket. And if you tilt your drill properly, you can control that little bubble, the bubbles at the top of the plaster, and bring them into a center vortex. And that is ideal because we're going to be scooping those bubbles off the top. We're going to be skimming them. And you can hold your drill like this, and you can skim at the same time. Here, we're about to do it. Photo 3, I got a little Dixie cup, and I'm just gonna scoop off that while I'm rotating the drill. I'm gonna scoop it off. Again, I wish I had a video of this, but I'm just not gonna set up videos to do all this plaster mixing these days. If it happens in the future, we'll film it, but right now, we got this. After you use your power mixing disc, you need to water it off into just a fixed water bucket, and then you can rinse it in that, and then you can put the drill into a dry bucket and spin off the water so it doesn't, spin off onto your clothes. The other thing is the care of this filter fan is you can get a lot of miles out of these if you just remember to clean them every now and again. They'll eventually clog up with plaster, and you're like, wow, I'm glad this plaster wasn't in the air, wasn't on my floor, etc., etc. And you get some pretty good life out of these. All right, so now that we've completed the plaster mold making of the cup, I want to show you really basic slip casting. Again, this is meant for beginners. There's an art to slip casting, but there's also just experience it for the first time to understand how the porosity of the mold impacts the way the slip is handled in the mold. So for this instance, I used a pre-manufactured bag of slip. It's, they UPS it to you, you pick it up at the ceramic store. The best way that I found to empty these was you clip the corner and then you can dump it into the bucket. It's a lot easier than trying to untie the top of the bag and to turn it upside down. Don't struggle so hard, you just need to make sure that piece of plastic's not gonna fall in the bucket. So anyways, then you wring out like a piping bag, a pastry bag, you're gonna wring that out into the bucket, get all that goodness in there. Now that the slip has been put in the bucket, I've put on a clean metal paint mixing blade onto my drill, and I'm mixing it up because the slip, when it's shipped, has probably been stored for a while and might have some chunkages in there. And anyways, I'm just mixing it up, make it nice and syrupy. Always label your buckets. This was a Cone 05 white slip. That's a low fire slip. So this is the simplest form of slip casting. Like I said, slip casting can be very fussy, and you can get into a lot about balancing the chemistry of your slip. There can be a lot of problems with slip, especially if you're using it again and again. The moisture ratio can be thrown off. But let me get through part one here. It's basically, I'm using the bucket to pour the slip into a dry plaster mold. There's lots of theories about what moisture level is the mold supposed to be before I pour into it. If you pour into a bone dry mold, it can kind of pull heavy and create these little pittings, if you will. So if you have a really dry mold, I would take a wet sponge and just wipe the interior of the mold, and it's going to draw in the moisture a little bit, and it's still dry enough to cast, but it kind of seasons the mold a little bit here. Now, if you use this slip again and again in a small kind of at-home environment, every time you pour that slip into the mold is taking water from it. And when you drain the mold, which is going to happen next, and when you drain the mold, it didn't happen next, I guess I'm looking at this. Once the slip is into the plaster mold, it begins to drop down in level because the moisture is being pulled into the ceramic, the moisture is being pulled into the plaster, and the clay level drops a little bit. Now in a fancy mold, you would design a reservoir at the top so that when the slip drops down, you never drop down below the detail of your model. But this is really simple student stuff. So this has been about probably 15 minutes. Looks pretty thick to me. I can't remember. When draining the mold, if it's small enough, it's a really good idea to rotate the mold so you get an even layer inside. If you dump out in one way, it will leave like this tongue inside that is thicker of the slip, and you don't quite get everything out. Also, when you drain the mold after this, you can turn it upside down onto a casting table or into another bucket, and you put a grill across the top of the bucket and you just set it upside down there, and it will drain off. Now, the mold has dried a little bit after I've drained it, and I'm just scraping off the top of the slip. Now, it looks counterintuitive that you would use a metal scraper to scrape plaster because you think that you can scrape up bits of plaster into your slip. But if you're gentle with it, it really isn't a problem, and I would do it all the time. Otherwise, you're trying to peel it off and, no harm done. So while the cup is still in the mold and it's beginning to dry, if I've noticed any irregularities inside of the cup, I can use a sponge to kind of clean the edge and use the stability of the mold to hold it in place. Otherwise, I might be doing cleanup outside and getting fingerprints on here. It's just a trick to do some edge work. After that casting slip has dried in the mold for maybe an hour or less, it's shrunk away from the plaster enough. So the slip continues to shrink as it dries, and then it comes away off of the edge of the mold, and then you can turn it upside down and extract it. This is just doing some finish work here. The casting looks pretty thick to me. You know, that's a person's call. If I did this again, it would probably be a little thinner. So I'm just sponging off the edge. Yeah, you can see that's pretty thick in my estimation. So here you go. You have the finished summary. The red plastic cup has now been molded in plaster, and the resulting greenware, the unfired casting slip, is to the right. And that's going to continue to shrink down. The casting slip is, I don't know what the shrinkage on this is. I can only guess on the low fire, maybe 10, 12 or more %. But I want to finish a thought. When I was talking about using the casting slip, after you pour the casting slip into your mold and you drain it, ultimately your extra casting slip is going to get back into your storage bucket. But if you think about it, it now has less water because the plaster absorbed water from the casting slip, and now you're draining a drier or a less moist casting slip into your reservoir, into your bucket, your storage bucket that I wrote 05 white, cone 05 white into. And that means that over time, your casting slip is not going to be correctly balanced, and it's going to be deficient in water and deficient in some other properties such as deflocculation, sodium silicate or Darvan. And so what you need to do is to constantly adjust your slip. If you notice it's too thick, you can add a little water. And you can get away with that for a while, but in any ceramic studio, the slip always has to be kept balanced. And there's ways to test that, but I'm not going to get into it right now. In general, this is a great exercise to teach a student how to make and handle a very simple mold and simple mixing with plaster. My recommendation to a teacher is when I was teaching mold making, I made a slideshow before I'd made this for the students, and I said, watch this presentation before I gave the actual demo, because what happens is a lot of times people are watching a demo but they don't even know where you're going, and so they don't get to absorb the steps in between and why something is important. So if you were to give this as kind of a pre-homework to your students, they're going to come in, and when you actually have a project to demo, it's going to be really great for them because they're going to understand, oh, the clay shrinks, oh, we're mixing the plaster, oh, all these other things, and they're going to absorb a lot more from what you actually teach. And when you give your students your first assignment, my recommendation is that everybody mold the same thing the first time, because otherwise you, the teacher, are going to be running around trying to manage, this guy's molding an orange, this guy's molding an apple, this guy's molding a hammer, and it's going to be too confusing. Let them get to that after they've proved their proficiency in mixing plaster, and you don't have to babysit the instructions at every step. You'll be exhausted. I used to teach a lot. Remember, I was the owner of Chicago School of Mold Making, and so it was always repeat, repeat, repeat. And if you spend too much time on the basics, which are critical, you never get to the good stuff. And what I want to do is to displace the basics into self-teaching, you know, a little didactic, hey, learn the basics first by watching, and then we can cruise through it. So thanks for watching. This has been our photo montage of basic plaster mold making and basic slip casting. So the good stuff is coming. I hope you enjoyed it.